May 27, 1942. Two assassins waited a hairpin turn in Prague. Their target is one man, not Adolf Hitler, not Heinrich Himmler, not Josef Goebbels. They chose Reinhard Heydrich. It was the only successful assassination of a senior Nazi leader during the entire war. The operation didn't just kill a man, it triggered a wave of terror that cost 5,000 innocent people their lives. Why him? To find the answer, look at his title. Heydrich was the chief of the Reich Security Main Office. He stood as the third most powerful figure in the Third Reich. He commanded the Gestapo, the SD intelligence service, and the entire internal security system. He was the man who watched everyone. But his power went deeper than surveillance. Heydrich was the primary architect of the final solution. On January 20th, 1942, he convened a meeting at a villa in Wannsee. He sat at the head of the table for 90 minutes. In that time, he coordinated the systematic industrial murder of 11 million people. The footage from the era shows his demeanor: cold, efficient, professional. During the conference, attendees discussed train schedules, logistics, and killing methods. No one raised an objection. No one argued. They treated genocide like a corporate merger. After the meeting, the atmosphere changed. Heydrich moved to the fireplace. He sat with his deputies. He did something his subordinates rarely saw. He smoked a cigar and drank glass after glass of brandy. The austere, robotic commander was celebrating. He had finalized the mechanics of the Holocaust. But this was only the beginning. The Allies knew Heydrich was the brain of the SS. They knew he was the most dangerous man in Europe because he was the most organized. They decided he had to die. Even if the price was high, events accelerated quickly. London trained the team. They provided the Sten guns and the modified anti-tank grenades. The plan was set. There was no turning back. At first glance, it was a military strike. But in reality, it was a death sentence for thousands. The sound of the grenade blast in Prague would echo for years. The story ended in a bloodbath. September 1941. Reinhard Heydrich secured control over the largest genocide in human history. The Czechs had a name for him: the Butcher of Prague. Even his fellow Nazis feared his lack of emotion. Heinrich Himmler described him as the man with the iron heart. Hitler appointed Heydrich as the acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. This territory is what we now call the Czech Republic. Heydrich wasted no time. Within 72 hours of his arrival, he executed 92 people. He filled the prisons and lined the walls with firing squads. Within months, the Gestapo arrested between 4,000 and 5,000 Czech patriots. They executed 500 of them immediately. Heydrich was efficient, he was brutal. He was transforming Czechoslovakia into a model Nazi territory. Why did the Allies choose to assassinate Heydrich instead of a higher-ranking official? It seemed like a suicide mission, but the answer was rooted in political desperation. By late 1941, the exiled Czech government faced a crisis. The country sat under German occupation. In Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece, partisan movements fought in the streets. In Czechoslovakia, there was silence. There was virtually no visible resistance. The territory was quiet. The factories remained open. Czech workers were producing heavy artillery, tanks, and ammunition for the German Wehrmacht. Under Heydrich's rule, industrial production actually increased. The footage from the time shows workers at their benches. There are no strikes. There are no explosions. Eduard Beneš, the Czech president in exile, watched from London. He saw the reports. The Allies viewed the Czechs as collaborators because the factories kept running. Beneš needed a signal. He needed a blood sacrifice to prove his people were still fighting. The silence had to be broken. Beneš realized that only a high-profile killing could change the narrative. He looked at the list of Nazi leaders. Heydrich sat at the top. At first glance, a stable province, but in reality, a ticking time bomb. The plan moved into the next phase. Training began in the English countryside. Special operations executive officers selected the men. They practiced with Sten guns and grenades. They studied maps of Prague. There was no room for error. Events accelerated. The mission received a code name, Anthropoid. 2 men were chosen to jump into the darkness. They knew the odds of returning were almost zero. The decision was final. London, 1941. Edvard Beneš sat in exile, watching his country's reputation disintegrate. At Allied meetings, the statistics were grim. Czechoslovakia ranked dead last in resistance efforts. Beneš looked at the maps in the reports. He felt a growing terror. If the Czechs did not fight back now, the Allies would ignore them during post-war negotiations. A silent nation would have no seat at the table. Beneš needed a catalyst. He required a single violent act to prove the Czechs were active participants in the war. It had to be dramatic. It had to generate international headlines and global sympathy. He made a cold calculation. He would not target a minor official. He decided to assassinate a top-tier Nazi leader. He would not strike in Germany, where security was impenetrable. He would strike in Prague, at the very heart of the occupied territory. The British Special Operations Executive, or the SOE, reviewed the plan. They agreed to provide the weapons, the training, and the planes. The British saw three distinct benefits. First, it would send a message. No Nazi was safe from retribution. Second, killing a security chief would paralyze the local command structure. Third, it would serve as a spark for resistance movements across the entire European continent. The planners looked at the hierarchy in Prague. One question remained: who was the target? At first glance, Karl Hermann Frank. He was the deputy and a known brutalist. But in reality, there was a much bigger prize: Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was one of the most dangerous men in the Third Reich. He had just chaired the Wannsee Conference to coordinate the final solution. He was the acting ruler of the Czech territories, known as the Butcher of Prague. He was powerful, efficient, and critically, he was arrogant. This arrogance became his primary vulnerability. The decision was finalized. Heydrich would die, but there was a warning. But Hitler himself had issued Heydrich 3 direct orders regarding his personal safety. The dictator demanded armored plates, high-speed convoys, and constant guards. Heydrich ignored them all. It was a fatal mistake. Use an armored vehicle, travel with an armed escort, vary the route daily. Reinhard Heydrich ignored all 3 rules. He drove through the streets of Prague in a green open-top Mercedes. He refused to carry bodyguards. He took the same predictable path every morning at the same hour. He believed himself untouchable and beyond the reach of any resistance. This arrogance became a death sentence. October 1941. Czech intelligence chief František Moravec began his search. He looked through 2,000 Czech soldiers living in exile in Britain. He selected 2 men, Josef Gabčík, a Slovak, Jan Kubiš, a Czech. They were sent to the rugged terrain of Scotland. The British Special Operations Executive trained them for months. They practiced with Sten guns, specialized explosives, and survival techniques. The mission received a name: Operation Anthropoid. In Greek, it means having the form of a human. December 28, 1941. Gabčík and Kubiš boarded a converted Halifax bomber. They parachuted into the dark over Czechoslovakia alongside 2 other teams. The drop was a disaster. High winds blew them off courses. They hit the frozen ground hard. Essential equipment was lost in the snow. They had to navigate occupied territory to find the underground resistance. The local rebels were terrified. They knew an assassination would trigger a wave of blood. By the spring of 1942, the operation was failing. Other parachute teams were caught. Some were executed. Security in Prague tightened every day. The resistance sent desperate coded messages to London. They pleaded to cancel the mission. They warned that German reprisals would destroy the Czech people. London did not hesitate. The command was confirmed: kill Heydrich. Time was running out. A new report reached the agents. Heydrich was preparing to leave Prague for a promotion in France. If he left the city in triumph, the mission was over. There was no more time for planning. They had to act immediately. 10:30 in the morning. Every day, the green Mercedes followed the same path through the Prague suburb of Libin. The car always slowed to a crawl at a sharp hairpin turn near Bulovka Hospital. This was the kill zone. The date was May 27, 1942. 2 men, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, waited at the tram stop. A third operative, Josef Valčík, stood 200 yards up the road. He held a small pocket mirror. When the sun flashed off the glass, it was the signal. The target was approaching. The dark green Mercedes appeared, decelerating for the curve. Gabčík moved first. He stepped into the road and pulled a Sten submachine gun from beneath his raincoat. He aimed at the passenger seat and pulled the trigger. The mechanism clicked. Nothing happened. The weapon jammed. Gabčík stood frozen in the middle of the street, clutching a useless piece of metal. The car rounded the corner. Reinhard Heydrich looked directly at his assassin. At this moment, the driver could have accelerated. Escape was seconds away. But Heydrich made a fatal choice. He ordered the car to stop. He reached for his Luger pistol, intending to kill the attackers himself. As the Mercedes screeched to a halt, Kubiš acted. He pulled a modified anti-tank grenade from his bag and threw it. The device did not land inside the car. It struck the rear wheel and exploded. The blast was violent, shattering windows and sending a cloud of black smoke into the air. At first glance, the mission was a failure. The explosion did not kill Heydrich instantly. In fact, the grenade barely touched him, but the force of the blast drove fragments of the car's upholstery, metal shards, and dirt deep into his torso. These particles embedded themselves in his spleen. The video of the aftermath would have shown a scene of total chaos. Heydrich did not fall. He climbed out of the wreckage and drew his firearm. He actually chased Gabčík on foot, firing several rounds before his legs gave out. He collapsed on the pavement. Meanwhile, his driver pursued Kubiš until the assassin shot the driver in the leg. Both operatives fled into the narrow Prague streets. They were convinced they had failed. They saw Heydrich standing. They saw him shooting back. They went into hiding, believing the most dangerous man in the occupied territories had survived. Events moved slowly after that. Heydrich was taken to the hospital, but the damage was invisible. The horsehair from the car seats and the street grime had already started a massive infection. Sepsis set in. The butcher of Prague was rotting from the inside. He died 8 days later. 7 minutes after the blast, Heydrich was rushed to Bulovka Hospital. The initial medical report listed a broken rib, a ruptured diaphragm, and metal fragments lodged in his spleen. Surgeons operated immediately. For several days, the doctors were cautiously optimistic. But the situation shifted on June 4, 1942. Sepsis began. Blood poisoning took hold, triggered by the debris embedded deep in his torso. Heydrich died in agony. The cause of death was not the Allied explosives themselves. He was killed by infected horsehair from the upholstery of his own luxury car. Hitler received the news in Berlin. He was furious. His anger was not just directed at the assassins, but at Heydrich's own carelessness. In private, the Führer vented to his inner circle. He mocked the decision to drive in an open, unarmored vehicle. Hitler called it damned stupidity. He stated that for a man as irreplaceable as Heydrich to expose himself to such danger was both stupid and idiotic. Those were his private words. Publicly, the tone changed. The regime organized an elaborate state funeral. Hitler stood before the casket. He placed the German Order and the Blood Order medal onto Heydrich's funeral pillow. He added other high-ranking decorations to the velvet. Then, he turned his attention to revenge. The first order was simple: execute 10,000 randomly selected Czechs. But the plan changed. Hitler consulted with his advisors. They argued that random massacres would hurt factory output and war production. Targeted reprisals were more effective. It was a cold calculation, a signal to the population. The Gestapo began the process. They captured and tortured members of the resistance. The sound of screams filled the interrogation rooms. June 13, 1942. A Czech paratrooper named Karol Kurta broke. He was terrified for his family and his own life. He walked into a police station and betrayed the location of the assassins. The footage from the time shows the aftermath. Gabčík, Kubiš, and the other resistance members were trapped. SS troops surrounded the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius. The standoff lasted for hours. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets of Prague. Grenades were tossed into the crypt. There was no escape. The commandos were killed during the siege. The Nazi machine had found its targets. This was the price of the assassination. Thus began the darkest chapter of the occupation. June 18, 1942. 800 SS and Gestapo soldiers surrounded the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague. Inside, 7 paratroopers waited. They had nowhere to run. The battle lasted 6 hours. The resistance fighters took positions in the choir loft and the crypt. They used pistols and submachine guns against a small army. When the Germans breached the nave, the assassins retreated into the cold stone crypt beneath the floorboards. The Germans tried to end it quickly. They fired into the basement. They tossed in canisters of tear gas. They brought in the Prague fire brigade to flood the tunnels with high-pressure hoses. The water rose. The air became unbreathable. Finally, the SS used explosives to blast through the stone walls. 14 SS men died. 21 more were wounded. Despite being outnumbered 100 to 1, the paratroopers refused to stop firing. But the ammunition ran out. The soldiers heard the final shots from inside. There were no prisoners. All 7 men committed suicide to avoid the Gestapo's torture chambers. Some used their last bullets. Others, including Josef Gabčík, swallowed cyanide capsules while standing in the rising water. The mission was over. But for the man who betrayed them, the story was just beginning. Karl Kurda received his reward, 1 million Reichsmarks. But the Nazis gave him more than money. They gave him a new life. They renamed him Karl Gerhardt and granted him German citizenship. They even arranged a marriage to a German woman, the sister-in-law of a Gestapo official. He became a professional traitor. The Gestapo used Kurda as a walking trap. He traveled across the country posing as a British agent. He met with resistance cells, earned their trust, and identified their leaders. Then, he watched as the trucks arrived to take them away. This continued for 3 years. Kurda's work led to the capture and execution of hundreds of Czech citizens. He became a shadow over the resistance. The end came in 1947. Kurda stood in a crowded courtroom during his treason trial. The judges asked how he could sell out his comrades. He did not look away. He showed no regret. Kurda looked at the court and gave a final answer. He said that anyone would have done the same for 1 million marks. The execution followed shortly after. April 29, 1947. At Pankrak prison, the executioner tightened the noose. The drop was quick. But the death of one man was only the beginning of a much larger disaster. The Gestapo needed a target. They needed blood to avenge the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. They moved through Prague, breaking bones and burning records. They looked for any thread connecting the resistance to a specific location. They found a lie. The source was a breakup letter. A man named Václav Zihar wanted to end an affair with his mistress. He didn't just leave. He wrote a note filled with fake drama. He claimed he was a high-level operative involved in the Heydrich hit. He wanted to look dangerous. He wanted to look mysterious. He was neither. He was a liar. A local factory owner intercepted the letter. He didn't throw it away. He handed it directly to the Gestapo. The Nazis didn't care about the truth. They needed a village to destroy as a signal to all traitors. They chose Lidice. June 10, 1942. German forces moved in under the cover of early morning. Lidice was a small village 12 miles from Prague. Population, 500 people. Soldiers blocked every exit. No one was allowed to leave. The execution started at dawn. They lined up every male over the age of 14 against a barn wall. 173 men and boys were shot. The sound of rifle fire lasted for hours. The women were rounded up next. They were forced into trucks and deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Most never returned. They died of exhaustion, disease, or medical experiments. Then came the children. Nazi racial experts examined them like livestock. They measured skulls and checked eye color. A few children with Aryan features were separated. They were given new names and sent to German families for Germanization. The others were not so lucky. 81 children were loaded into gas vans at the Chelmno extermination camp. They were murdered with carbon monoxide, but the Nazis wanted more than death. They wanted erasure. They burned Lidice to the ground. They used heavy explosives to level the ruins. They plowed the earth and removed the village from every map in the protectorate. Events accelerated. 2 weeks later, on June 24th, the village of Lidice suffered the same fate. Every adult was shot. 33 people died in a single afternoon. The children were sent to the camps. Why did the killing continue? The Nazis wanted the leaders. Bishop Gorazd, the head of the Orthodox Church, knew the end was coming. He had sheltered the assassins in his cathedral. To save his congregation, he made a choice. He wrote a letter to the Nazi authorities. It was a confession. "I and I alone am responsible," he wrote. He turned himself in. He hoped his death would stop the reprisals. It didn't work. The Gestapo executed Gorazd along with his priests. The footage from the time shows the aftermath: empty churches and blood-stained floors. Despite the torture, the priests stayed silent. None of them betrayed the resistance. Others chose their own end. Marie Moravkova, the mother of a resistance fighter, heard the boots of the Gestapo in the hallway. She didn't wait for the interrogation. She swallowed a capsule of cyanide. The story cut off here. The interrogation ended. Her entire family was executed by firing squad. During the immediate wave of reprisals, German forces shot over 1,300 Czech citizens. Thousands more were arrested. They were loaded into cattle cars and deported to concentration camps. Most went to Mauthausen. Very few survived the stone quarries and the gas chambers. 5,000 people. That is the estimated total death toll of the Second Heydrichiad. 5,000 lives taken to avenge a single Nazi official. Was Operation Anthropoid worth it? Historians still argue over the answer. At first glance, a strategic success. But, in reality, a tactical disaster. The immediate military impact was non-existent. Heinrich Himmler simply stepped in to handle Heydrich's duties. Later, Ernst Kaltenbrunner took over permanently. The Nazi machine did not miss a beat. Events accelerated. A dark irony emerged from the bloodshed. The final solution did not slow down after Heydrich died. It moved faster. Within months of the assassination, the death camps at Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec became fully operational. The Nazis gave this mass murder project a name: Operation Reinhard. They named the genocide in Heydrich's honor. His death did not stop the Holocaust. It became a memorial to it. The Czech resistance was destroyed. Gestapo raids wiped out the underground networks. The movement never fully recovered its strength, but politically, the assassination achieved the exact result Edvard Benz wanted. The footage and photos of the destruction of Lidice sparked global outrage. The world watched the ruins. In response, towns across the planet renamed themselves: Lidice, Illinois; Lidice, Mexico. Streets in the United Kingdom and South America took the name. The story dominated international headlines. The narrative changed. Now, everyone knew the Czechs were fighting back. On August 5, 1942, the British government took a decisive step. They formally repudiated the Munich Agreement. This was the document that had legally handed Czech territory to Adolf Hitler. The borders of pre-war Czechoslovakia were suddenly back on the diplomatic map. The cost was 5,000 lives. The result was the restoration of a nation. The era of appeasement was dead. 1945. The war ended, and the map of Europe changed. The death of Reinhard Heydrich proved a critical point to the world. High-ranking Nazi officials were not untouchable. They could be hunted. They could be killed. In 1944, the British military drafted Operation Foxley. This was a direct plan to assassinate Adolf Hitler. The mission remained on paper and was never implemented. Why did the Allies choose Heydrich instead? The answer lies in the brutality of the aftermath. The British and the Czech government in exile understood the consequences. They knew massive reprisals would follow the hit. They knew innocent civilians would be executed in the streets. They proceeded with the mission anyway. At first glance, a strategic victory, but in reality, a moral minefield. Was the sacrifice justified? The Czech patriots who died in the following weeks seemed to believe so. They endured brutal interrogations. They suffered physical breaking. Even under extreme torture, they refused to give up names or locations. Bishop Gorazd and his priests were lined up and shot. They went to their deaths in total silence. A harder question remains. Is it ethical to eliminate one monster if it guarantees the slaughter of thousands of innocents? The answer depends on your location. It depends on whether you are looking at a map in London or standing in the village of Lidice on June 10, 1942. Reinhard Heydrich was a primary architect of the final solution. Other Nazis described him as cold and brutal. His assassination stands as the only successful Allied operation to kill a top-tier Nazi leader during the entire war. The footage of the aftermath shows the scale of the hunt. Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík parachuted into the dark. They dropped behind enemy lines with no extraction plan. They knew the odds of survival were zero. Their courage was absolute, but the cost was higher than anyone predicted. 5,000 Czech civilians were murdered in retaliation. The SS erased entire villages from the map. They burned houses, shot the men,